Well, Scott, would love to learn about your journey. Tell us about your story.
So, I think kind of similar to Lenny's. Mine was, I don't know, I feel it's unique, at least it's unique to me, right? Up until 10 years ago, I was a legacy guy. I worked at big banks. I worked at, broker-dealers. I was a FINRA examiner. That was my background. Go back to 2013, something that kind of triggers an innate want to learn more about it. It's crypto, it's blockchain. And all I know is that it looks really interesting. It looks like there's a lot of promise there. And there still is, despite everything that's happened over the course of the last few months, especially the last few weeks. But there's a tremendous amount of promise. There's a lot of opportunity there. But I want to do more with it. And, that was just not something that I could pursue within the confines of a traditional financial institution. I made an attempt. At the time I was working for Citigroup. They certainly acknowledged that, what I was talking about was really intriguing and really interesting. And, certainly a concern for the bank, but, minimal, fractional. So for me, that was kind of the catalyst for it, the genesis for the idea of I want to go out, I want to do something different. And, initially it was crypto, it was blockchain, and, one of the first compliance people to actually go out and, kind of be active and try to do something in that space. And, that's where I've been for the last 10 years. But more broadly now, fintech, of course, payments, lending, not just crypto and blockchain anymore.
Yeah, it's really great to see a FINRA examiner come to the, the dark side. Well, I'd love to get a better sense in terms of, one thing that we talked about was build versus buy.
Mm-hmm.
How have you faced that in the organizations that you're in? What were the major challenges? Where do you see are the pros and cons of different approaches?
So, whenever that topic comes up, and inevitably it comes up, kind of the first thing that I always think about is that it's that quote from Jurassic Park, right, with Dr. Malcolm, where he's like, you spend so much time thinking about if you could, you never stop to think if you should. Right, and that's always kind of the first thing I think about when it comes to building a solution of this type. I think in some parts it's ego kind of gets in the way, or maybe it's a bit of hubris or something like that. But the question that I want to ask and have answered, are we capable of building this? And I don't just mean engineering, because to simply say that it's engineering's responsibility to build it. Engineering, product, different companies, different names, whatever. We need this, go build it, here you go, here's what it looks like, here's what a competitor does with it, or, like a Unit21. Go make this, go replicate this, let us know when it's done. It's not quite that simple. I mean, if you're going to commit to building something internally, it's going to be a cross-team effort. It's going to be engineering, of course. It's going to be product. It's going to be legal. It's going to be compliance. It's going to be risk. It's going to be fraud. You're probably going to see, a contribution from teams like customer support. In my experience, I've always found customer support to be a fantastic team, because based on their interactions with the customers, they tend to be on the leading edge of what is coming. Maybe they don't have actual, access to the data, but, based on the types of inquiries that they're seeing or questioning, whatever. Point being, it's a cross-team effort. And is that level of commitment there? And is that level of capability there, that knowledge, that experience? And then, after you ask that question and have that question answered, then you can get into the more traditional, okay, well, engineering or product, we'll just say engineering, are, you going to be committed to this after the initial, so we've done the design, we've done the build, we've done the testing, we've deployed it. Now, do you understand that once it's been pushed out, that's not it? It doesn't just sit and operate and function and just kind of hum along. There's going to be improvements, tweaks, changes that are going to be required. Are you going to be committed to that? Are we going to have dedicated resources for compliance concerns or fraud concerns? Or are we going to have to fight for cycles with the development cycles with our engineering team where, hey, we want to roll out a new monitoring rule set or a series of them, stay in front of this fraud. We need them, rolled out ASAP. Well, we can talk now about maybe getting you on the calendar for the next quarter. That doesn't work.
Fraud doesn't wait till the next quarter.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's so much more to it. I'm not trying to break it down into what is, like little sound bites or something like that. But I mean, I feel like they're very basic questions. They're very simple questions. What is your capacity to build it? And also to make clear, it's not just engineering. If you're going to build it in-house, there's a lot of different disciplines, knowledge, experience, expertise. And if you don't have that, I mean, what are you going to give your engineering team?
Yeah, no, it certainly is really interesting. I worked at a firm for 4 years, and we decided to build everything internally, and no one was ever happy. It was a constant state of dissatisfaction, and then ultimately, it was just such a horrible experience for a lot of people. We had a third of our engineering team was dedicated to risk engineering, and we had competitors who were moving faster. This was not really the core focus of the business, was not to build internal tools, but we did lose a lot of time. So I can completely empathize. So switching gears, you were a FINRA examiner. What do you think about the whole evolution of the sponsor bank, fintech, fraud liability?
So, my experience with that would be more so on the compliance side than the fraud side. But, I would say that having reviewed, any number of, MSAs with, bank partners, issuing banks, whatever you want to call them, first and foremost, whatever your responsibilities, your obligations, your mandates are that are going to come from that bank partner, they're going to be spelled out there. And now that's not to mean that that's where it starts and it stops. You certainly use that as your kind of baseline, and you want to go from there. But that's going to be your first place. That's going to be your go-to to identify what your obligations are going to be. And again, we're not talking about like regulatory obligations to the extent that you're regulated. We're talking about bank partner obligations. Again, my experience, fraud is something that is typically not really spoken to in an MSA. That is more of a up to you as the fintech to design and implement a program that is going to sufficiently speak to and address the risks and risk and fraud that your platform, your service represents. That said, what is something that's always going to be table stakes? I've always seen it is going to be compliance with the identity theft red flag rule. You're always going to get the questions around what are you doing to prevent identity theft? And that can be a pretty wide-reaching inquiry, right? I mean, it sounds pretty basic and sounds pretty simple at first, but when you actually start to go through, all of the various identity theft red flags that are identified, like the FTC communications, I mean, there's a lot, it's page after page after page. So, it can impact various types of platforms, various types of service, all lines of business.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting with especially the Blue Ridge, the whole breakdown of the sponsor bank fintech relationship. I think there's a lot that needs to be built with respect to the trust between the two parties. Last question. Fraud and AML, FRAML, is it a thing? Do you believe in it? Do you feel like
sure.
They should be separate teams?
No. I think, it's going to be dependent upon the fintech. It's going to be dependent on the company. Certainly, if you have an earlier stage company as opposed to a later stage company, the more mature the company, the bigger the operations get. You want more dedicated, more focused personnel. You're probably going to have someone who's directly responsible for that with more intimate knowledge of fraud versus AML. Or if you had an earlier stage, you might have someone like me who has some exposure to fraud, is stronger on the compliance side, but has the fraud background. So you can kind of fill in a little bit there. Regardless, even if you don't have the two teams that are kind of under the same umbrella, and I think this comment would speak to the point that Lenny made. Transparency, communication within the organization is key. You cannot simply just risk and fraud or risk fraud and compliance or whatever. Everyone can't be their own island. A fraud is a predicate. It's a acknowledged predicate crime to money laundering. Where you have fraud, you're almost certainly going to have money laundering. And if you're going to prevent that, you're going to need all of these people working on these teams, working in concert together, all rowing in the same direction.